Johnny Rotten didn't just hate pop culture. He despised its royalty. Bands that critics worshipped, he trashed. Legends that fans idolized, he called frauds. But why? What did he see in these mega bands that the world ignored? Today, we'll uncover 6 world-famous bands Johnny Rotten openly loathed, and the bitter, brutal, sometimes shocking reasons behind his hate. Stick around, because the last band on this list, it involves a betrayal so personal, Rotten never recovered. Before Johnny Rotten ever spat into a mic or sneered through a lyric, he was just a sickly, working-class kid growing up in the crumbling tenements of North London. But even then, one thing was clear: he didn't trust smiles. And no one smiled more than the Beatles. To millions, they were gods. Flawless harmonies, matching suits, peace signs, and platitudes. But to Rotten, they were the first lie pop culture ever told him. He once said, "The Beatles were garbage. They represented the establishment we were told to trust." To most people, this sounded insane. But in Rotten's world, it made perfect sense. See, by the time the Beatles were conquering the charts, Rotten's family was being evicted. His father, an Irish immigrant, worked brutal hours while the news praised the glory of modern Britain. His neighborhood had more rats than record stores. And when he saw Beatles fans screaming and fainting on TV, Johnny didn't see music. He saw hypnosis. To him, the Beatles weren't rebels. They were mascots of the system. Everything looked too polished, too coordinated. It was theater. And in his mind, that kind of performance had nothing to do with truth. But it wasn't just about sound. It was about control. By the early 70s, long after the Beatles had broken up, their legacy had grown into a religion. The press treated Lennon like a prophet, McCartney like a king. But Rotten couldn't forget how quickly they had abandoned their roots. From Love Me Do to Sgt. Pepper, he saw a group that started as working-class lads but morphed into detached millionaires. He hated how their evolution was praised as growth, when to him, it looked like selling out. Rotten, born John Lydon, didn't believe in subtlety. When the Sex Pistols came together in 1975, his mission wasn't to entertain. It was to shatter. During an infamous 1976 television interview, he grinned and mocked the Beatles. "They're dead, aren't they? It's just corporate noise now." The anchor tried to push back, but Rotten doubled down. "Peace and love? Please, more like profit and lies." The public was stunned, but Rotten had struck a nerve. See, under the surface of Beatlemania, there was a growing generation who didn't buy the dream. They didn't want more kaleidoscopic ballads or sitar experiments. They wanted to scream, and Johnny gave them the soundtrack. To him, music should never be a lullaby. It should be an alarm. The Beatles, with their orchestras and cryptic lyrics, were the opposite of alarm. They were the bedtime story. But behind his anger was also pain. As a teenager, Johnny was nearly killed by spinal meningitis. He lost his memory for nearly a year. Woke up confused, disoriented, and angry at the world. During his recovery, nurses would often play Beatles records to soothe him. But instead of comfort, they brought confusion. "I didn't feel love," he later said. "I felt insulted." In those formative years, when he desperately needed something real, all he got was prepackaged hope. So when punk exploded in 1976, Johnny Rotten wasn't just tearing down the Beatles. He was avenging his past. He once declared, "I'm not anti-music, I'm anti-lies." And in his mind, the Beatles were the biggest lie in rock history. To the outside world, this looked like jealousy. But to Rotten, it was justice. Even years later, when other punks mellowed out and admitted grudging respect for the Fab Four, Johnny never budged. "You can't rewrite truth," he said. "They didn't speak for me then, and they don't now. But the real twist, In private, Rotten admitted to admiring one thing about the Beatles: their power. They proved music can rule a generation, he once said. So I thought, what if we use that power to destroy instead of sedate? That's the paradox that haunts Johnny Rotten. The band he hated most also taught him how dangerous music could be. And maybe that's why he feared them. If the Beatles represented the polished lie, then Queen, according to Johnny Rotten, was the glamorous hallucination. And to him, hallucinations were dangerous. At first glance, Queen and the Sex Pistols had nothing in common. But in the mid-1970s, they shared a stage, the British music scene. While Queen wore capes and dazzled with operatic ambition, Rotten and the Pistols were tearing down tradition with 3 chords and a sneer. And yet, they were often spoken about together. 2 sides of the same era. To Rotten, that was insulting. He once called Queen the fake aristocracy of rock. But his hatred wasn't just about their sound, it was about what they represented. Freddie Mercury stood for theatricality, for elevation, for fantasy. He painted music in glitter and diamonds. Johnny Rotten? He wanted music to bleed. He wanted truth with scars and spittle. The moment that sealed Rotten's hatred came in 1976, during a now infamous media clash. The Pistols were booked for a late-night BBC interview. Why? At the last minute, they were bumped for Queen. Rotten was furious. The reason? Freddie Mercury had allegedly injured his voice. But Rotten saw it differently. He backed out because he didn't want to face us, Rotten said later. He didn't want his fantasy to be shattered by our reality. But the tension didn't stop there. That same year, Queen released Bohemian Rhapsody. It was a masterpiece to many, but to Rotten, it was self-indulgent fluff. He couldn't stand the production, the overdubs, the opera sections. To him, it wasn't music. It was a musical mask, a performance that never let listeners see the real people behind the notes. I don't hate Queen because they're bad musicians, he once admitted. I hate them because they pretend to be more than human. That's the core of it. Rotten didn't believe in idols. And Queen were practically deities to their fans. He saw the bowing crowds, the crown imagery, the carefully constructed mythos, and it made him sick. Rotten wanted filth. He wanted crackling amps and missed notes and lyrics that could start fights. Queen offered melodies that soared. But to him, they soared over people's heads, deliberately. They make you feel small, Rotten said. That's not art, that's ego. But behind that venom, there was also something else: fear. Freddie Mercury's charisma was overwhelming. His voice could melt granite. His presence on stage? Magnetic. Even Rotten, in rare candid moments, admitted that Mercury was dangerous in the wrong way. Not because he was a threat to punk, but because he was a seduction too powerful to ignore. He was everything we were taught to destroy, Rotten said. But even I couldn't look away. In a twisted way, Queen became a mirror for Johnny. Where he tore things down, they built illusions. Where he exposed pain, they transcended it. And while he resented them for it, he also envied their control. There's an infamous story from a party in 1977. Queen and the Pistols were both invited. Rotten never showed up. Later, someone asked him why. His answer? Because I knew I'd punch someone, and I didn't want it to be Freddie. That wasn't a joke. It was restraint. Rotten couldn't stand being in the same room as Mercury. Not because of hatred, but because he feared that, deep down, he might admire him. The irony? Years later, after Mercury passed, Rotten was asked again about Queen. People expected another insult. But what he said surprised everyone. I hated the fantasy, he said. But I never hated the man. That's as close to forgiveness as Johnny Rotten ever came. Because for all his rage, all his rejection of glam, of myth, of icons, Rotten wasn't heartless. just guarded. And Queen, especially Mercury, made that guard tremble. That's the twist. He didn't hate Queen because they were fake. He hated them because they made his truth feel small. And in Johnny Rotten's world, nothing was worse than that. Of all the bands Johnny Rotten hated, one hurt more than the rest. Not because they were bigger, not because they were louder, but because they were supposed to be on his side. The Clash were born from the same wreckage as the Sex Pistols, rising from the smoldering streets of 70s London with jagged guitars and protest in their blood. They were punks, rebels, revolutionaries, or so the world believed. But Johnny Rotten, real name John Lydon, called them APRs, tunt with guitars. And when he finally cut ties, it wasn't just professional, it was personal. To understand the betrayal, you have to rewind to the very beginning. In 1976, punk wasn't a movement yet. It was a rumor, a whisper of something raw and unsanitized. Rotten and the Sex Pistols weren't famous, they were dangerous. Playing in dirty clubs, getting banned from radio, chased by tabloids. And in that fire, they met the Clash. Back then, Joe Strummer wasn't an icon. He was a squatter with a voice like gravel and fire in his eyes. Rotten and Strummer talked politics, shared gear, even traded lyrical ideas. It wasn't friendship. It was something deeper, mutual recognition. Rotten saw Strummer as a fellow truth-teller, someone willing to scream at power, to reject commercial comfort. But something changed. In 1977, the Clash signed a major label deal with CBS. A multi-album contract. The ink was barely dry when Rotten snapped. He felt betrayed, abandoned, sold out. He wasn't naive. He knew bands needed labels. But it wasn't the signing that broke him. It was the speed at which the Clash changed. Their music grew slicker, their clothes more deliberate. Their lyrics began to carry slogans instead of scars. To Rotten, they had taken the blood of punk and turned it into a bumper sticker. They were businessmen in leather jackets, he said later, selling revolution by the pound. The world didn't see it that way. The Clash exploded. Their 1979 album London Calling was hailed as genius. Rolling Stone called them the only band that matters. That, quote, it infuriated Rotten. He saw it as proof of how easy it was to fake rebellion, how the machine could market protest as product, and how the Clash had played right into it. He once told an interviewer, "The moment you let the system praise you, you've already lost." But the deepest wound wasn't public. It was what happened backstage at a festival in late 1979. Rotten showed up unannounced. The Clash were headlining. Word spread quickly. Johnny Rotten was in the crowd. Instead of inviting him up or acknowledging him, the band's manager reportedly asked security to keep an eye on him. Rotten heard, and he never forgave. They treated me like a problem, like a relic. But we built that stage. Without the Pistols, there is no Clash. From then on, it wasn't just criticism. It was war. He mocked them in interviews, called them student revolutionaries with trust funds, accused them of using poverty as aesthetic. But underneath the rage was something deeper. Loss. Rotten had believed in them, believed they were the real thing. And when they rose to fame, instead of using that spotlight to torch the system, they posed in it. In one of his final rants on the subject, he said, "I didn't hate them for being successful. I hated them for pretending they were still struggling." That's the twist. Rotten wasn't jealous of the Clash success. He was devastated by their dishonesty. Because Johnny Rotten could forgive bad music. He could even forgive excess. But what he couldn't forgive ever was betrayal of the working class. And in his eyes, the Clash went from voice of the people to voice of the brand. Years later, when Joe Strummer passed away, people expected Rotten to make peace, to soften. Instead, he released a short statement. Just 7 words. Too late for truth. Rest in noise. It was cold, sharp, dirty, final. And yet, underneath it, you could still feel the ache, the wound that never closed. Because Rotten didn't just lose a bandmate or a movement. He lost a mirror.